Even though the 40th anniversary O-Ring Ghostbuster sets from Hasbro are kind of random, they're a ton of fun. I'll explain why on this episode of Geek Dad Life. As a kid of the 80s and 90s, I definitely had my fair share of G.I. Joe figures like this Tiger Force Duke. And even though I wasn't like a diehard G.I. Joe fan, I always loved the form factor of the G.I. Joe O-Ring. The articulation, the posability, all of the kind of fun play features that were allowed because of the O-Ring design made them, in my opinion, the best, bar none, articulated figures that you could get in the 80s and 90s, at least early 90s.
G.I. Joe! It's the young G.I. Joe Extreme!
And while Kenner Real Ghostbusters toys had my heart and are still my all-time favorite toy line from my childhood, I kind of always wish that my Ghostbuster toys had the same articulation and playability as my G.I. Joe toys. And I know I wasn't alone, because in the early days of the internet, a lot of customizers took G.I. Joe toys and turned them into Ghostbuster toys. Fast forward 40 years after that original film hit theaters, we finally have G.I. Joe style real Ghostbuster figures alongside a re-release of the Plasma series Afterlife Ecto 1. Now, I do think that HasLab that back late last year that gives us a 6-inch scale Ecto 1 for the Plasma series overshadows this set, both the Ecto 1 and the figures. I still think it's really cool that Hasbro put this out for the 40th anniversary, especially since they don't really do O-Ring anymore. They did a little bit of O-Ring re-release for G.I. Joes and then quickly dropped it. So it's cool they brought O-Ring over to Ghostbusters. And even though I'm way more excited for that HasLab set to arrive, which will probably be another year, I had to see if O-Ring Ghostbusters toys were as cool as I thought they would be when I was a kid. While I have the packaging, let's talk about it real quick. The Ecto 1 is nothing too fancy. If you have had a Plasma series figure or toy before, it's got a lot of the same hallmarks. You've got the flight suit kind of beige color throughout. Awesome back view of the Ecto 1 here on the side. We've got some highlight boxes here showing the different features of this Ecto 1 set. You've got the front of the Ecto 1 as well. And then there's a bunch of jargon here on the bottom. Nothing too special about this box. Does its job. It's not very big. It basically is just big enough to fit the car itself, with the roof rack kind of tucked inside. Speaking of that roof rack, this thing is pretty easy to put together. The only problem I had was trying to put the antenna, the front antenna, into the car. It was a little too big, so I had to heat it up and then get it into the little slot there. Now let's talk about the packaging that came with these 4 figures. All 4 figures are in this 40th anniversary set, and it is designed to evoke the look of the original VHS tape, which I have here. It's such a iconic look that RCA Columbia Pictures boxes that all VHS for Columbia had in the 80s. They had this red outline, and for some it looked really good, some not so much, but I think it looked the best for Ghostbusters, which I think rings true. A lot of packaging or even book designs, covers, stuff like that, borrow a lot of the things that were a part of this original Ghostbusters VHS tape. It has some stuff on the inside as well, a little blurb about the Ghostbusters, showing some of the accessories. I love that we have the Ray and Winston there in the front seat, like that iconic moment in the film. All figures present nicely once you cut open the tape to show the figures inside. So if you want to leave it in box, it's a really nice box to leave it in. All right, now that we've talked about the packaging, let's talk about these toys outside of the packaging, and let's start with the Ecto 1 itself. So if you have the Afterlife Plasma series Ecto 1 that they released, I think it came out in 2020, maybe it was 2021, somewhere around there, then you know what to expect with this set, other than it's not all gunked up and rusty and stuff like that. So, but really it is like for like. They haven't really changed anything on the mold except for the ladder being on the correct side, and they remove the gunner seat that is on the Afterlife Ecto 1. I also put this thing side by side to that Hot Wheels Elite 124th Ecto 1, which was expensive back when it was released, and I'm sure it's just as expensive now. And while that one does look better than this Ecto 1, if you don't want to spend that much money and you don't necessarily want the 6-inch scale Ecto 1 that Hasbro offered with the HasLab, this Ecto 1 I think looks fantastic. This Ecto 1 does come with one big accessory. It is the gurney to put the proton packs on. Can you get the proton packs on it? Yes. They kind of just sit there. They don't really lock in, and When you push them in, they kind of just fall all over the place. But if you're trying to do some toy photography, you can sit the little proton packs there. And in general, it works okay. Not great, but it's fun that they threw it in here. Are there problems with this vehicle? Yes. So let's talk about those. While you can fit 2 figures comfortably in the front, the way they engineered the back, they took out the gunner seat, but there's just not enough space between the 2 chairs to fit 2 figures there. You could maybe fit 1 figure there, but 2 is darn near impossible. I mean, you can shove them in there, but they're not gonna be able to sit down comfortably like they would in the real Ecto one. So that's a limitation there. All right, let's talk about the O-ring figures. So if you have had any G.I. Joe O-ring, you kind of know what to expect here in terms of articulation. It does just about everything a vintage or vintage style O-ring G.I. Joe would do, and they kind of angled his arms and his forearms and his hands so he can kind of hold his Neutrona wand in a somewhat convincing position. The head sculpts are pretty solid considering the scale. They kind of all look like the actors as portrayed in the movie. I think Ernie Hudson's Winston looks the best here, and I would say probably Peter's is the least accurate out of all of them, which is usually the case with all of his figures. I don't know, just Bill Murray's head is hard to capture, but again, it still kind of looks like him. It's not too bad. The paint is pretty simple. There's not much there, but the paint that it does have, I think looks pretty good on all of these. I also love that we got the detail on Peter. He has his pant legs over his boots, and then the rest have it kind of more military style tucked into the boots. The trap accessory is fun. The PKE meter accessory works great, as well as the Ecto goggles for Ray, but I will say they're tiny and they'll probably get lost really easily, so just be aware of that. They're really small, and I've already almost lost them a couple times in the few days I've had these things open. The proton pack accessory works like you think it would, right? You have the screw in the back for the actual O-ring to lock in both halves of the mid-torso of the figure, and then it has a little plug that goes into that screw hole, and that locks in your proton pack, and it looks great. It looks great on the figure. The Neutrona wand with the cable that connects to the proton pack is made out of like a thinner, more malleable plastic. It does have me worried over like long-term use of this little plastic cable. Like, will that break over time? I hope not. It's honestly a really well executed vintage style O-ring Ghostbuster. It is honestly better than any custom job I've seen for a Ghostbuster figure, and honestly better than some of the other 3 3/4 inch custom 1984 Ghostbuster figures that I've seen. And that kind of captures what I think these 2 sets are all about, the Ecto one and the O-ring plasma pack, is giving us toys that we very well could have got in 1984. Famously, the Ghostbusters movie was a huge hit, but it wasn't really merchandised towards kids until the 1986 Real Ghostbusters cartoon show, and those toys were based on that cartoon show, not the movie. But G.I. Joe was alive and well in 1984, and you could have maybe imagined Hasbro picking up the license in 1984 and leveraging their O-ring technology from the G.I. Joes and making an awesome 3 3/4 inch scale vehicle for the Ghostbusters to fit inside. Would they have been as detailed and accurate as these ones that we've gotten 40 years later? No, but that's kind of the magic of this set. You can get a highly detailed O-ring set of figures of all 4 classic Ghostbusters. You can get a really nice detailed Ecto one for those Ghostbusters to sit in, all for around $100, and I think that is a pretty darn good deal. So if you're already getting that Ghostbuster Plasma Series Ecto one HasLab, and you already have a bunch of 6-inch Plasma Series figures, maybe you don't need these. But if you haven't tapped into any modern Ghostbuster toys yet, and maybe you prefer the 3 3/4 inch scale, or you just want a nice representation of Ghostbusters on your shelf, for $100, this is a pretty darn good set. You get 4 O-ring figures that look fantastic. You get an Ecto one that is really solid, and these figures are just a ton of fun. So these definitely get the Geek Dad Life buy rating. These things have been around for a little bit now. I assume they'll sell out eventually, and the price for these will probably go up. So if you are interested in these, get them now while the price is still good.